All right, hello everyone, and welcome to an episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. And for my very special guest today, it's none other than Christopher Ruocchio, the author of the Sun Eaters series, which I have been thoroughly enjoying. Christopher, it's really a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh gosh, thanks for having me. The pleasure is mine. Great to be here.
Awesome. And as you know, I have been reading your series. I've actually been listening to the audiobooks. And shout
Oh
out
yeah,
to your narrator, Samuel Rukin. Is that how you say the name?
Rukin. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's been tremendous.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. He is, as many people have told me, he would become the voice of Hadrian for me. So yeah, just a really marvelous performance that he's put in there. I've been loving these audiobooks so much. So yeah, and I've been discussing the series with the author Johnny Wirtz, who is a legend and also adores Sun Eater. So that's been really something, and the wonderful duo from Talking Story, father son. That's John and Jacob Minton. And of course, our good friend Dylan from Spaced Out Reads. So we've been having a blast talking about your series. Just deeply appreciate what you've achieved here.
Yeah. No, I've been watching those actually. They've been great fun. So thanks for doing those.
Good, good. Yeah, I don't know if
Yeah.
it's more nervous for you watching someone talk about your books, or if it's for us knowing that you've been watching now, then we'll be nervous in turn. So a little bit of vengeance for you there, I suppose. But
No. There's always a little apprehension clicking on a video. A little tense for the first 10 seconds or so, but usually it's all right.
good,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I do know that feeling. But so I want to talk about something that we've talked about a little bit in our discussions. And this is the idea of how an author uses influences and sources in their work. And this is something that you have received some criticism about from some quarters.
Sure.
And I actually had some ideas going into your series. And I'm so happy that I'm talking about this with Janny Wirtz particularly because I think she has helped me to understand right away, actually, right with Empire Silence. I got a much better idea of what I think you are doing in Sun Eater as you're using your influences and sources. But before I ask you to talk about it, I do want to mention a couple examples because I think what you're doing is similar in some ways to them. One being a writer that we both admire very much, and that is Guy Gavriel Kay. I'm actually reading Sailing to Sarantium right now and loving it as I've loved every single book that I've read by him. Just a beautiful writer.
He's a
But
genius.
yeah, absolute genius. I agree.
Yeah.
Absolute genius. But one thing that I noticed very quickly while reading Sailing to Sarantium is that he's pretty much used the story of Justinian and Theodora, the Justinian being the 6th century emperor of what we now call the Byzantine Empire. And I mean, there's really some very strong similarities between the fictional characters that he has in Sailing to Sarantium and these historical figures. In fact, it even gets down to the it's as close as basically quoting like Theodora, for example, as she was giving her advice as to how to deal with the Nika riots. There's a it's really close
Yeah,
to
it's like
what
word for word. Yeah.
pretty much word for word.
Yeah.
And you see him doing this, and yet it is not the story of Justinian and Theodora. It is something else. He has transformed this story into something else. Even though you could say, oh, wow, he just took this and this and this and all these beats and everything else and these iconic moments, they happened historically. But no, he has done something else with this. Okay. So I think he's a really great example of what an author can do with source material, even when you can map it really closely. Now, I certainly in my own writing, I mentioned to you before we started recording, I quote Beowulf and that kind of thing. This is the sagas, and I have fun with that. That's a lot of fun. I think a lot of us writers, we like to give nods to our predecessors, our inspirations, them that way. But what GGK is doing here is clearly on another level. He is using a story, and he is in some places very closely, using it, but he's transforming it into something else, and that is tremendous. That's beautiful art. The other example I want to give, which may sound a little weird, but I think it's appropriate because I see so much joy and playfulness in how you use your literary illusions. And this reminds me in many ways of what Oda does in One Piece, which if you read One Piece, you know that there are riffs on Dante, there's Gulliver's Travels, the guy is just there's a plethora of literary allusions. It's just all over the place. And you do something very similar in Sun Eater. So a kind of combination of GGK and Oda.
I'll take it. My brother will be very happy to hear it. He's been trying to get me to read One Piece for like 10 years.
Okay. All right.
No, one of these days.
Cool.
It's just so daunting. There's just
It's
so much of
big.
it.
It's big. I'm
Yeah.
nearing I'm nearing the point where I'm going to be current myself. It's been
Oh wow.
more than 2 years. So yeah. But anyway, so this is all my long-winded way of basically asking you, how do you use your sources and your inspirations in your writing? And I think we could go a ways toward helping people understand what you're actually doing there, because you do have moments in Sun Eater where you have Hadrian, for example, saying something that's very similar to what Severian says in Book of the New Sun. There are those
Sure.
moments, and I think as a writer, you're assuming there are readers who are going to notice that, and then they're going to make the next step, hopefully, which is, okay, why is he doing this, right? What is he achieving here? So I'll stop blabbing and let you talk about what you're doing here.
Yeah, well, it's that next step that always sort of, or the failure to take that next step that always surprised me because I never thought I was, there's been an attitude that I've been sneaking this past people or trying to sneak it past people. And I didn't think I could. There's a story in Empire of Silence where Hadrian talks about a wizard he heard of, right, who would check the gravity of a planet by playing with a yo-yo, right? And this is a Doctor Who reference.
Uh-huh.
And some guy was like, "Did he think that we hadn't seen Doctor Who?" And I was like, "No, I thought you would laugh."
I
You
was
know,
hoping you had seen Doctor Who. Yeah.
yeah, I was hoping you would pick up on it, and so do with everything, really, right? I don't expect any reader to catch every single thing that I'm trying to connect to there, but I'd hope they would catch enough to be amused or entertained or ask a question about it, because some of them are quite serious, right? The series is pretty intensely in conversation with the original Dune books, right? The six in terms of
Absolutely.
Frank's questions about heroism and the dangers of heroism, which I tend to disagree with him. I understand him, but I disagree with him quite strenuously in certain ways. And
That's important. I just want to interrupt you for a moment if I could. Yes, you are using a lot of the world building of Dune, and some of the the chosen one kind of gone wrong sort of thing. You're clearly using that inspiration, but I totally agree with what you just said, and that your take on this is different. And same thing with Hadrian versus Severian. Hadrian to me is a much more emotionally resonant character than Severian. I'm not. That's not a knock on Gene Wolfe. If he had wanted to write an emotional story. I'm sure he's a brilliant writer. He could have done that. But that's not what he was doing. He was really steeping his story in symbolism. That's my take on it anyway. But you're giving us something different with Hadrian, aren't you?
Yeah, well, in a lot of ways, the difference between Hadrian and Severian is sort of a difference of time, right? I think that the expectation of modern readers is to have a much more intensely psychological look at the characters. I think a lot, and I failed largely in working on my new project to, I think a lot about the difference between the fantasy writing of like the 1920s and the fantasy writing of now. I'm a great Robert E. Howard fan, and he can accomplish so much in 10,000 words that most writers alive today can't do in 100,000, myself included, right? And it's because the relationship of the story to the prose is so different, right? In terms of what information is conveyed and how and at what level of resolution. And one of those big changes is a intense hyper focus on interiority. And this is one of the great advantages of prose literature is that you can actually explore that dimension. You can kind of do it in film, depending on how symbolic you want to be and how much you want to lean on voiceover, if you want to be if you want to cheat. But it's really, the unique province of literature to really get inside a character's thoughts and feelings. And so in a sense, to not do that seems to miss the point of the medium to me. But at the same time, that comes at a cost. I can't tell a story like Black Colossus in 10,000 words because I am taking the time to really sit with my character's feelings. And I have ultimately decided on the new project that that's okay. Like maybe I can't be Robert E. Howard. Maybe I can, I can learn a couple things there, but I can't actually cut the book in half like I had sort of originally envisioned. The new book's sort of indexing about Demon and White sized. God help me. And uh, you know, uh, it's a sickness. It really is. But I really with everything, right? And it's not just literature, but it is with Sign Eater. It was primarily with literature, it was with other works of science fiction. I just sort of a very oppositional thinker. I find that I discover what I think by looking at what other people think and disagreeing with them often, right? Or less frequently being like, oh yes, of course, I'm on the same page, right? Exactly. You get the people poetry snapping and saying preach or whatever. But
But
uh
you're saying you're in a kind of dialogue with this
yeah, yeah,
book
and
of the
and I don't think that
sun.
that's not novel or anything. I
Oh,
literature used to be called the Great Conversation. There are a few of us who still call it that, right?
yep.
And I remember there's an essay Ian Banks wrote about his culture books, which are great. I love them. But it is called like a few notes on the culture or something, and he contended that future civilization must necessarily tend toward anarchism because how could you possibly enforce a civilization that had access to so many spaceships, right? And the answer to that seemed obvious to me. It's very hard to get off planets. You just control the spaceships, Ian. It's I don't know that I would be so triumphalist about anarchism in a space opera setting necessarily. And so, in a lot of ways, the Silent Empire at a world building level was sort of a response to the culture, which again, these are books that I love, but I find completely implausible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just because human nature is what it is, and
So
I
that
also,
that there, okay, so that's a great
yeah,
example where you've got your class structure, which in some ways resembles what Frank Herbert was doing in Dune. But then what's the difference now, right? And that's what you're talking about. And we are standing on the shoulders of giants, indeed, but we are also able to tell new stories by using those. And as a medievalist, what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. In fact, I think medieval authors would have been puzzled by this whole conversation in a way, because for them, that's what you do all the time. And Chaucer would, it would be, we'd call it plagiarism today, what Chaucer does, where he translates, Petrarch and inserts that little piece into the Canterbury Tales or whatever, I get it. I get what I think you're doing, and I think there are some authors still, but I think the emphasis in modern times on individuality and we're less communal in some ways. I think in our storytelling, we don't have that communal property of a story that we feel is everybody's to play with, right?
yeah, and I think ultimately this is a particular sickness I think in genre fiction because the emphasis on sort of created worlds, right, and the sense that what you're making should be a new creation, as if it could be, right? I tend I'm Catholic, Tolkien was Catholic, and so I tend to agree with Tolkien basically 100% of the time.
Uh-huh.
All we're doing is rearranging the parts of God's creation. We can't make new stuff. There's the old is it Descartes example where he's like, imagine an animal, right? A new animal. You made it up of pieces of other animals, didn't you? Right? And of course you did, right? Like you can't, the most out there science fiction creature, right? You look at Rocky from Project Hail Mary, right? Is incredibly inventive scientifically, right? But it's a spider, and like you can kind of, and it's also a starfish, and it has some like sort of novel ideas, but those ideas are all either informed by extant scientific principles or other examples from the animal kingdom. We're not creating new stuff whole cloth. We can't. And so, the idea that you can do that as a writer or should even try, I think, is silly. But I also think that this is maybe an invasive weed from the business people too, right? I
Hmm.
think that the idea that what you must create has to be sort of a new IP, right? In sort of a legalistic sense, I think is sort of driving a lot of this. Because I mean, you go look at Narnia, right? I was just sort of looking at a couple of things about the new film in fear and trembling, and just remembering the all the biblical stuff that's in there, right? Just like little details and things like that. And all of that is obviously not Lewis, right? Santa Claus is not Lewis, right? He doesn't own those things. And you know, and, and it would be silly to sort of say, hey, C.S. Lewis, you ripped off the Gospels. You ripped off Christmas time, right? It's like, no, he's employing them, right? And I think it's strange that we should treat science fiction novels differently.
Hmm.
Is Dune not a great novel of the 20th century? Should it not be? engaged with? Should it be put on a pedestal and put in a museum and never ever touched or played with? I say no.
Mhm.
Now, like I understand if people think maybe, in some sort of microcosmic way I've done something foolish, right? Or I've overstepped in certain specific ways. And I think Empire of Silence is sloppier than Disquiet Gods. I was 18 when I wrote parts of it.
Which blows me
And
away, actually,
yeah,
that you were that
well,
young, you know.
uh,
It's incredible, actually. But
well, thanks. I didn't do a lot between the ages of 8 and 18 except try to write it. So, I came at the cost of, extracurricular activities and a social life and things,
well, for us, thank you
Well,
for
yeah, no,
sacrificing
I don't.
your social life. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't trade it honestly, but
I do think though that that's an important point because when you're young and you have all these wonderful, you've engaged with stories. I imagine you were a big reader when you
yeah,
were young, and particularly even when you're a little bit older. I didn't actually start to write creatively until I was in my early 30s, and I could see easily that a lot of the stuff that was most important to me. I was a huge Tolkien fan growing up. I mean, he was the reason I even wanted to try, really. So it was
yeah, same.
obvious to me that I'm channeling Tolkien here, especially in the first book. I think it's almost something you got to get out of your system almost, until you actually find your voice, until you're more confident in your own voice. So it doesn't surprise me that you would feel that Empire of Silence, your first book, which you wrote when you were actually very young, maybe you had less control over what you were doing. And I think I'm in book four. I've read book four, and I think you're doing it very skillfully at this point. So, but
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you. One always hopes, you're getting better. I'm finding now working on the Doomsong books that it's been nice to be unshackled from the decisions I made as a teenager.
uh-huh.
Um, and so I had to go back and write a Sun Eater story. And I had a certain dread is a strong word, but I had a pretty great degree of apprehension about going back. I was like, I was just sort of free of 18-year-old Christopher's choices. Now we have to go back. But the thing about creativity, right, is that sort of being shackled to those things actually is a blessing in a lot of ways because you have to
Mhm.
sort of figure out. The example I usually talk about, and I just talked about this in another interview I did, is I reverted to Catholicism sort of in the editing of Empire of Silence. And so I was stuck with a book that my agnostic self had written that I no longer really agreed with some of the precepts and world building decisions and things. I had
Interesting.
to sort of figure out how to turn the chantry into something I could live with.
Uh-huh.
Since it was clearly a one of a thousand crappy parodies of the Catholic Church in science fiction. One thinks about the Ori and Stargate or something, right? And
Yeah. Oh, I've done one myself in my fantasy trilogy. So,
yeah, it's hard not to. It's we make great villains because we should be the opposite of that. And nobody,
Mhm.
institution run by human beings is perfect. And so I totally understand. Besides the aesthetics are very cool, and that's part of it too, right? To get back to Dune in a lot of ways is the aesthetics of science fiction as a genre are kind of set in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
People have expectations about what a spaceship is, and what kind of technologies or institutions we might have in certain flavors of the future that have been imagined, right? As any art form matures, its conventions ossify, and I could certainly come in and you know do none of that, right? And try to write something completely unlike any of the science fiction that people are familiar with. A lot of that happened with the sort of a new wave space opera in the 80s and into the 90s. You got all these characters with lots of Y's and X's and apostrophes in their names, and 18,000 different species and 20,000 sexes and all this stuff. And stories, and I hate them mostly. I hate those stories. I There are some great space operas from that period. I'm a huge Lois Bujold fan, but
Uh-huh.
Bujold I think largely wins on the strength of her human characters and their humanity. And it's about a planet that is basically Tsarist Russia. These things are very kind of grounded and recognizable, but out there, right? And stories are about people, and the strength of Dune is that it is about a world that looks, if you squint, like ours. And I sort of wanted to do more. My favorite moments in Dune were when it tied back to us, right? And Paul is a seashell from Earth, and they talk about a Van Gogh painting, and I had that same Van Gogh painting show up in Hell and Dark as sort of advanced nod to Chapter House Dune, right?
Right. Yeah.
And but I wanted to do more of that. I wanted a future that is our future. I felt like really no space opera had done it enough. There's so much discontinuity in science fiction settings with our reality, and uh, we treasure our own past, right? Decreasingly, the modernism is a sickness, but I wanted to write a future that was ours and that was embedded in our time, because I thought that would be better. That was sort of a difference with Asimov and with Herbert. I felt like they hadn't done that enough. But I needed to sort of cleave to the traditions of science fiction, the galactic empires and things, the force fields and whatnot, because that's what science fiction fans like. And my instinct was, I like Dune. Surely other people like Dune, right? It's one of the greatest science fiction novels of all time. What if I did a thing that was like Dune, but then became very unlike Dune, right? What could I do to make it different? Aliens, obviously, there are no aliens in Dune.
Hmm.
What if the powers were real, right? They weren't just all lies, right? In a lot of ways, I came to realize that Sun Eater is closer to Lynch's Dune than Herbert's, right?
Hmm.
And uh, and so I made some pretty basal distinctions from Dune early on, but I wanted to keep some of the familiar appearance because people like stuff because it's cool.
Hmm.
And it is that simple, right? It's sword fights are neat. And we should have them in space because that makes them cooler. What can we make the swords cooler? Oh, we have plenty of examples from science fiction of swords that are cooler, right? And why don't we riff on those, right?
High matter
I like Star
blades.
Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Love it.
you
Yeah.
know, um, but we have to make them different, and like, how can we make them different? Well, lightsabers don't really make sense, right? The science is just not there, right? They'd have to be like 10,000 degrees. It would just be dreadful, right? So I had to sort of change that. And my own personal background, I have a background in Olympic style fencing and stuff like that. So I
I've seen
focused.
videos of you fencing a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually funny. I found yesterday after I beat Christopher Paolini, a random person gave me a star, and I found it on my desk yesterday, and so I have this trophy from vanquishing Paolini.
That's
Um,
awesome. That is so
uh,
great.
it was very fun. It was very cool
He
for me
wasn't
because
too
I was
bad either, by the way. He seemed to know what he was doing.
no,
Yeah.
no, he did great. But I was a big Aragon fan when I was 10, so I think that's how old I was when it came out, and it was just a very sort of out of body moment for me. It was neat. But in sort of focusing on the swords, right, as an example, I focused more on how you would use them and less on how they worked because I'm that kind of science fiction writer instead of an Andy Weir or something like that. And so this is just one example of how, you make an aesthetic decision based on a book that you like and you carry it all the way down to sort of a granular thing, right? And really, if anybody wants to pick on anything in the book that they don't like, I can tell you exactly why it's there. And what I thought I was doing, you could say that's stupid or I still hate it. And that's fine. But none of the point of none of this was to try and like steal valor from Frank Herbert. I can't do anything to hurt Frank Herbert, and I wouldn't want to. I thought that I had something to say about Dune as a cultural artifact and as a tentpole of the genre, and I thought that I could say it, and I thought that I should say it, and I thought in a certain sense that like I should say something about the best books in science fiction, because if I wasn't trying to in a sense go after them, right, in both senses, right, antagonistically, but also in the sense of following after, then what was I doing? Am I gonna like hit low hanging fruit? No, if I have a disagreement, I should disagree with the biggest books in the genre. I should take swings at them and for their sake, and to follow after them. And so, of course, I had to take a swing at Dune and a swing at Hyperion. Um,
Mm.
Not because I dislike them, but because I revere them, precisely because of that. You know, I if I were writing either of those books, there are things I would do differently, and in a sense, I have. And I think is that not what culture is?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
you know,
It's
so
a continuous dialogue, isn't it?
you,
Yeah.
Yeah, the French get into the Arthur stories, and suddenly Lancelot is the guy, and of course he is,
Thanks to
so
Chrétien de Troyes. Yes,
yeah.
yeah. Brilliant. Well, this actually is a great segue to my standard question on Dear Dr. Fantasy, which is going on the theory that you are what you read, Christopher. What have been some of the most formative reads of your life? And feel free to go back as far as you like. You probably have mentioned a few of them already, but maybe you'll surprise us. So, tell us about your reading journey.
Yeah, so I was reading really early. I remember I was given a copy of the first Harry Potter book when it came out. I was 4.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
and I didn't quite make it through by myself. My parents helped, a little bit, but I enjoyed the story at 4. And I remember just barely being bullied for liking it before it was Harry Potter, right? Just barely. And that was sort of my entry into fantasy, because it was sort of unavoidable. In parallel, my dad had the laser discs of the original Star Wars trilogy, and so science fiction really began with Star Wars. And I'm the oldest child, so my parents were very restrictive about the media that I consumed. Less so my younger brother. He got
Okay.
to play Halo at like age 6, but not me.
Typical,
And
typical. Yeah.
yeah, this is how it is. I tell the story frequently just for my mother's sake. Hi, mom. Because she gets vexed with me every time I bring it up. But I went from there into reading sort of Star Wars books. They had a lot of like early reader kind of little chapter books about young Obi-Wan and stuff like that. Because this was right as the prequels were coming out, uh, and then I think I probably moved from there into like H.G. Wells because that was like the extent of the science fiction my parents were really aware of. So I read The Time Machine, I read War of the Worlds, and then I was given a copy of Dune in like 6th or 7th grade by my friend Marcus Gibson, of the name. And
Okay.
it turns out, had not read it. He'd seen the David Lynch movie and thought it was cool, and was just telling me the book was cool. And he read it after I read it, and it was sort of I was sort of lost at that point. Uh, but I was at the same period really into Tolkien. The movies were coming out, so it was also an unavoidable thing. I would have
Yeah.
read Garth Nix's Old Kingdom books around that same period, which I still really really love. And but Tolkien was really the guy, right? As I got the unabridged audiobooks on CD. I had this like giant box set, Rob Inglis recordings, and I destroyed them. I must have gone through them 80, 90, 100 times.
Hmm.
Because I would put them on and I would go to sleep, and then I would absorb Mirkwood in my sleep, right? And then I would wake up and then like realize I missed half the disc, and then go back, and just my whole childhood for years, as they
Wow.
were the only audiobooks I owned. Um, and so like I would read constantly, but I had those as like the lights are off kind of thing every night just for years.
It
Um,
actually it pleases me immensely that franchises like Star Wars have had such an influence across generations. I grew up in the 70s, and the first movie I can remember watching in a theater in 1977 was Star Wars, the original Star Wars. And
yeah,
it was a huge part of my childhood as well, and Tolkien as well. And I love that the Peter Jackson movies, as different as they are from the
yes.
books, and we could go on and on about that. But I do like the films. I'm not going to be one of those, oh no, you left out Tom Bombadil, so no good, you know?
It seems like they're going back for him now. We'll see how
Yeah,
it
yeah.
goes. Uh,
Good old Tom Bombadillo. Yeah.
yeah, I love him, but yeah, they are obviously very different. But they served as a way of sort of opening the books up to a lot of people, myself
Yes,
included,
exactly.
and they've extended, in a sense, the lifespan of the books. The books were not suffering for readers in any way, but they have not done any harm, I think. And I am one of those sort of Tolkien purists who say, well, Aragorn is quite different in ways that kind of hurt my feelings. But Vigo is great, right? I would never mess with anything that's there, even though it's wrong. It's so close to right, and it's so tremendous. But
Yeah,
it still got me there, right? And then
absolutely. I mean, I think they managed to preserve, although there's a greater emphasis on the action. It's a
Sure.
different pace from the books, but they did manage to preserve in ways, and they were respectful of the reverence that just suffuses the books. I think that that was an important thing to get right.
Yeah, the essential heart is there, right? The idea of good being accomplished in these small ways, right? And perseverance is still there. It's not messed with, even though Faramir and Aragorn suffer some character assassinations, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it isn't. I mean, certainly in the universe of bad adaptations that we've gotten, it's not even close. It's things have gotten so bad, and
No,
they've always
it
been. I
does
mean.
stray further, I think, than a lot of people realize from the books. I
Yeah,
think
it's yeah. People are largely, I find, oblivious to the fact that it's quite different, and I don't know if that's because most people who've seen them actually haven't read the books. But the conversation, people are always surprised. I find when I say, "Well, it's pretty different, actually." I don't know if you've had the same experience. Um, uh, but Dune was middle school, and that really opened up science fiction for me. Because before then, I was sort of aware, like I say, Wells, Asimov, Clarke. I think I read the 2001 books before that. But in ninth grade, high school, I had the opportunity to take a science fiction literature course. My high school offered one
hmm,
for half a year,
great
and it
high
was taught
school. I
by
love it. Yeah.
yeah, it was awesome. It was taught by older guy, Mr. Goheen, who was sort of like a Worldcon attending fan. This is one of those things I'm finding talking to fans of my generation. People don't realize the word fandom used to refer to a discrete group of people.
Hmm.
It was the people who ran Worldcon, right, and the attendant conventions for decades, right, and I was taught by a fan, right, and so I then had sort of an education in his books, right? The stuff he liked, which kind of ended in the 80s, really. And so I was reading not Robert Jordan, right? So I've largely missed out on these sort of staples of modern fantasy. I haven't read Wheel of Time. I tried Malazan, and God help me, I could not get into it. I bounced off quite hard.
It's a favorite of mine. I don't know if you knew that or
No, I know. That's why I mentioned it and said,
not.
yeah, forgive me. But
Yeah.
I one of
That's
these
okay.
days, one of these days.
I mean, it is a
Uh,
series that I'm not gonna
no,
spoil
that's
your
fine.
read or anything, but it is a series that I think I understood it much better the second time I read it. Maybe that's not the best thing to say to people is that, oh, you'll get it the second time after you read these 10 huge books.
No, it's okay. I'm a Gene Wolfe fan, so I'm
There you
used to
go.
it.
Yeah.
But I just it just maybe wasn't the right time, or maybe I needed to read it and not do the audiobook. I'm not sure. But I instead read like C.L. Moore and Lee Brackett and A.E. Van Vogt and a bunch of Philip K. Dick and stuff like that instead. And so I find that the science fiction fans I have books in common with are like 80. And like that, that has its virtues. I'm a big fan of like the weird tales period. I mentioned Howard earlier, but
Yes. Yeah.
Lovecraft obviously, but also like Clark Ashton Smith and all of those guys. And I mentioned Moore already. And so I like that really early period where science fiction and fantasy aren't even really differentiated yet, right? It's just kind of a thing. And uh, and so that was pretty formative in its way. And then later, you got writers like I mentioned Ian Banks, but also like Alistair Reynolds. I love Alistair Reynolds. I think he's the greatest living science fiction writer. I just think he's a genius. And Kay is an influence as well. And then I started working in college at Baen Books, and so it's there that I found Louis Bujold and David Drake because I was working with them, and that was very very special because that they're both just geniuses. Dave's no longer with us, but
I
but
plan
he
to be
was
reading some Bujold later this year. So
great.
where should I start? What's the best place to start for me?
Her famous series is the Vorkosigan books, her science fiction series. And I usually recommend people start with Warrior's Apprentice, which is the third chronologically, fourth if you count. There's a standalone. But it is the first one that stars Miles, who is kind of the main character. The two earlier books are about his mother, and they lead up to his birth. But I find they're not really representative of the larger series, and you could treat them as prequels and then go
Okay.
back and read them just fine. But they're both great. Shards of Honor is the first one for the main sequence, and they're mostly very short. It's like 60, 70,000 words. But the next one is Barry R, and Barry R is a Hugo winner, and it's a there are, I think, 4 or 5 Hugo winners in the series. It's I think the it also won the first best series Hugo, so I think it's the most Hugo winning series of all time. And those were all early enough that I feel those awards really count. And
Tremendous. Wow.
Yeah, it's a great series, but her fantasy, which I've never actually read, I have been because we didn't publish all of it, and so I just sort of had it over there in my head. But like the Curse of Chalion and stuff like that,
Yes.
I've been told if you like Hay, actually, it is in that direction. And Bujold is just such a tremendous character writer. I see her compared to Hobb frequently. I'm largely ignorant of Hobb, as I say, because I missed a lot of these modern
Oh, you hadn't read
contemporary
Hob.
writers.
Okay. Okay.
No,
Yeah.
I have like a fear about these giant series. Having written one, I just like I always worry like, do I have time to read Wheel of Time? I'm old. I have I have this tiny skull right up here. You can't see it, but it just reminding me all the time.
You're
Do
actually
I have
not much older than my daughter, so yeah.
no? I feel the press of time.
Okay. Okay.
I remember reading about Sanderson having planned his career out to 75 or whatever, and thinking, oh no, I haven't done that. But his sort of high mortality salience there
He's a
is
highly planned guy, and I'm very impressed by that.
I wouldn't plan 40 years in advance, but that he is thinking that far made me think that I should. And so I worry about every hour in a sense, especially now I have 2 small children. I found that having a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old really underscores the value of every 30-minute interval of every single day in a way that is uh, really something. um,
It's a good thing they're
uh,
so cute.
Yes, yeah. It's like, oh, good, they're asleep. I can accomplish 2 things before they wake up. Yes. What are they going to be? I don't know. And Yeah. Anyway, but that sort of hits the at least the literary sort of timeline.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I could talk about the influence that other media have had. I do think you mentioned Oda earlier, right? I have not read One Piece, but I am tremendously influenced by manga and by anime and by video games.
Okay.
Um,
Neat. Okay. Yeah. Well, tell me
I
about some of
Yeah.
your favorite. What are a couple of your favorite mangas?
I grew up largely on sort of the Toonami shows, right? So things like Cowboy Bebop and Fullmetal Alchemist and things like that, sort of the obvious ones. And then really I didn't start reading manga that intensely until I was an old teenager and then a young adult. And Berserk is perhaps the most obvious sort of major influence. You want to talk about sort of being playful with references. Mike does not like the running commentary from the Fairy that includes a bunch of Hulk Hogan and Star Wars references in what
Ah,
is otherwise a very grim and dreadfully serious work of literature.
ah,
But
ah.
I always thought they were funny. I found the constant, Darth Sidious jokes amusing, actually. And there's something of that kind of bucket kitchen sink mentality, right? That I find I emulate, and I think that this might just be sort of a staple of Japanese storytelling, sort of
Uh-huh.
generally, is that there is a lot more vagueness about genre. I grew up playing a lot of like Final Fantasy and the Tales games and things like that, and there is a like weird sort of permeability about genre. You'll find robots and otherwise high fantasy stories. Um, and things like that I've always found quite attractive and have sort of emulated.
So
And
maybe my observation that your playfulness with your literary allusions and references being similar to manga isn't way off, it sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah, just not One Piece in particular, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember when One Piece was localized, and thinking like, oh, maybe I'll watch that, and then never getting around to it, and
Yeah.
then being buried 10,000 chapters deep. So um
Yeah.
it would have been the 4 kids days. So but yeah, so I do think that there's probably something to that. I'm not really cognizant in outlining of any sort of Aristotelian structure. And I think that having read Poetics, right? But I don't really think that way. I think that maybe there's something of, there's a sort of idea in Japanese plotting. And every time I talk about this, I forget the Japanese word. It starts with a K, and someone in the comments will tell me and be like, Christopher, why do you keep forgetting? But how the story will sort of move, and there'll be a breaking point, after which point there'll be a series of sort of wild tonal reversals as sort of we move towards the conclusion. And you see this in Berserk, where it's kind of a low fantasy story until it's really, really not. I don't know if you've read it, but then suddenly all the
Not
sort
yet.
of
I
like
think it may be after One Piece. If you and others convince me I should read Berserk, maybe I'll do it.
um it is bleak and grim and deeply unpleasant in a lot of ways. And sort
Yeah.
of the extremeness of the content. It was kind of a staple of adult manga of the late 80s to just kind of really push the envelope. Just sort of a statement on where Japan was culturally at the time, and is and remains in a lot of ways. But I personally don't think that it does it just for fun. I think that it is really doing that to try and earn the seriousness of the story. I don't think it's just trying to be shocking when it brings in stuff from sort of Clive Barker, right? And it quite, talk about illusions, right? It like quite nakedly borrows from Hellraiser and sort of puts that in a high fantasy setting, and then also ties in. There's a the villains are all named after science fiction novels of the 60s and 70s. There's a character named Void who's named after Frank Herbert's Destination Void, right? And so all the demons have science fiction title names, which is quite fun for me, because there's so much sort of talk about Western creators borrowing from anime and manga, but it's they're sort of an earlier generation of the reverse. And like Vampire Hunter D borrows from Moorcock very intensely, and all this stuff. And it's sort of nice to see the circle kind of get completed. George Martin got brought into to world build for Elden Ring, which is one of my favorite works of fantasy ever
Yeah.
in any medium. And but you read the interviews with the Miyazaki, the Japanese director, and he's talking about growing up reading Tough Voyaging and Sand Kings
Ah,
and all this stuff. And it's just nice to, it is one planet, right?
it is indeed.
And
Yeah.
and that sort of cultural diffusion and reinterpretation and interpolation of things is very nice, because the Japanese sort of lacking a cultural grounding in Western culture, right, will use stuff from Western culture in completely bizarre ways. And so I'll go and play these games and see all this Catholic stuff used in ways that would never occur to me to use them, and often in inappropriate ways, but in interesting ways. And sort of that kind of playfulness writ large has been and willingness to sort of make those swings and to conflate things that it would be maybe inappropriate, right, if you were more familiar with the cultural background, right, has been sort of a broad kind of source of inspiration for me, regardless of the individual stories in question. Just that attitude has been
Wow, brilliant.
important.
Wow. Well, speaking of all these stories and the cultural diffusion and all of that, there are some wonderful themes that you do deal with in Sun Eater that have really resonated with me, and I admire the way you're handling them in such a broad manner. I think that your tendency to reach for other stories, to do these illusions, is really adding to your exploration of these themes in some very significant ways. I'm enjoying it tremendously. One of them, I'll just ask you a question about one of them. That's class division. That is something that is exacerbated in the future. You show us in the Sun Eater series, and this is largely due to technology, to the ability to genetically modify the noble classes, if you will, or add machinery. Essentially, the division has actually become a chasm because you almost have different species at this point,
Yeah.
where they've been so changed by technology, which is expensive and available only to the elite, and is controlled by the elite. So I guess I want to ask you is it inevitable that technology will increase class division in the future?
I think so. I think that there's a certain amount of conservation of ugliness in human civilization. I'm not convinced necessarily. In a lot of ways, modern society is better, right, than the medieval world, right? But there's also a sense in which I think that the ugliness is kind of redistributed and pushed around, and things are a
Mm,
little bit different. Now, we don't have like a sort of inbred aristocracy of largely foreign people ruling over us, right? But we do have an aristocracy in America, and we'd be foolish to pretend that we don't,
yep.
right? And in a sense, the sort of removing of the trappings of aristocracy has made that harder for people to see, right? And I think that that is uh, actually worse. Like there are other things that are better, but the fact that it's not clear who is in charge,
Hmm.
and in what way they're in charge, and to what degree, right, is actually a disadvantage over medieval monarchies, right? It's that guy in the shiny hat right there. I can see him across the battlefield, right? He's over there. We can get him, right? And then things will be different. That is an advantage that the medieval peasant has over us, right? It's actually much harder to sort of change modern institutions. Now, like that's maybe good for aggregate stability, right? I bring this up not to sort of agitate for revolution, but simply to point out that, um, you know, actually class division remains, right? We have all these pretenses at egalitarianism, and just because I can call the guy in charge Sir or Mister whatever instead of Your Royal Imperial Majesty, blah blah blah, and recite the whole grand title of the Emperor of Austria.
Or
Um,
Emperor
you
William.
know, yeah, right. Which honestly, if you've ever read the grand title of the Austrian emperors, I mine is short.
Really?
Um,
Okay.
it's so long. It's very impressive.
You were having a
Um,
lot of fun with that still, though, I
uh,
think.
Titles are really fun, right? And this is in the aesthetics, right? The aesthetics of empire are interesting, right? And we have sort of a very stripped down sort of civic aesthetic as Americans, and I think it might be an impoverishment. It might be funny. It might be better if we had shiny hats. I'm envious of the British; their shiny hats
I
and
do like
their
shiny
cool,
hats. Yeah.
their cool robes, and But in any case, setting aside that, it's not clear to me that class division is better now, actually, right, in real terms,
Mm.
than it was in 1500. I just now, like maybe the sort of extreme privation of sort of the floor has come up, let's say, right? But I think that the divisions between the sort of senatorial American class and you and me is still pretty steep, actually. And so I don't see that technology will necessarily make it worse. I think it will maybe extremify it more in terms of that degree. What am I trying to say? Um,
Mhm.
I think the divisions could get harder and sharper, but I don't know that there'll be necessarily more divisions. There might be. You can imagine how the creation of technology could create new categories and more categories, but I don't know that it's really different. I'm ultimately with Aristotle. I think there are three forms of government, and I don't think that we've really invented any new ones. We've just kind of iterated on the oligarchy, democracy, monarchy, um, and um, and within those, I don't know that the amount of sneering that happens from the top toward the bottom and vice versa has changed. Um, I think it's all aesthetics ultimately.
Wow.
And even with technology, I think it will ultimately be aesthetics. I think I got a little bit lost in that answer, trying to
No,
find it.
brilliant. In
Sometimes
fact,
but
you gave
yeah,
me a good segue to the next question, actually.
yeah.
So,
Well, there we go. Okay, I'll take it.
yeah, but well planned. So the fact is, you could look at societal forces, the pull toward hierarchy, as a deterministic factor. And another thing that you do explore in your series, very deliberately, again, is free will versus determinism. And I think in the context of what constitutes humanity, what is essential to our personhood. And so, also within this discussion, I think you were looking at how do our choices have repercussions. And I do believe that I'm seeing some theological influences in your
Sure.
exploration of this. You mentioned your friend Gibson, that you've named a character, a very important character after. So yeah, I guess I'm asking you to talk about your thoughts on this exploration that you have set up of free will versus determinism, because I thought I saw some I thought I saw some in particularly Kingdoms of Death. I'm looking forward to the end of the series, but I thought I felt okay. I think I know what Christopher Ruocchio would say from these little moments in Kingdoms of Death, particular Hadrian moments, especially, but other moments as well. So yeah, I'll just hand it over to you. The free will versus determinism question.
Yeah, I mean, I ultimately am a free will absolutist. I
Yeah.
think that really, when the chips are down, everybody has the ability to choose. Now, I don't believe that everybody has good options. I think actually most of the time we don't have good options. And I think that people's will to sort of choose absolutely is often sort of hampered by their vices or by social convention or their ignorance or whatever, right? We all are sort of bounded by what's possible, right? And so, even if we would like to choose something, we can't, for whatever reason. That doesn't mean that the choice doesn't exist or that the sort of philosophical maximum is invalidated. But it's a very difficult world that we live in, and as a Catholic, the solution for this is fundamentally grace, right? Either that we have for other people, or that God has and gives to us. And I really sort of, one of the ways I look at this is with the people who are at the upper levels of society, because those people actually have way less choice. Right, than people at the bottom. This is an observation Chesterton makes frequently: is that really, the medieval peasant has a lot more day-to-day freedom than the king.
Mhm.
And this is completely sort of alien to people who grew up with princess movies, because Disney is not real. Disney's not even fairy tale. It's
Wait, it
something else
isn't?
entirely.
Oh
No.
no.
People are just like, oh, you get to be, in charge and have all the shiny outfits and stuff. And it's like, those are consolation prizes, actually, for a tremendous amount of misery and drudgery, actually. The nice food helps, but um, if you are uh, in the position of king and trying to take that position seriously, your life is not easy. And this is something with the character William in the series. I try to actually take seriously, because we have an American tendency to make every king in literature a monster.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
because of George III, and even George III was not a monster, right? He had some mental health issues, but he was largely a guy trying to do his best.
He was
He
dealing with
was
forces way beyond his control.
Yeah, and he was like, I was reading about him recently. He's quite a frugal person. He was very worried about his weight, and so he ate like a peasant, like on purpose.
Hmm.
You see this too with like Nicholas II, right? These are guys who like have problems, and like Nicholas was not a good administrator by any means, but he was seemed to be an eminently decent man,
Hmm.
right? And I wanted to write that character instead, right? And actually, I also wanted to write that character being very effective in his job, right? I wanted to sort of steelman the Galactic Emperor, having strawmanned him in Sheev Palpatine for so many decades. As much as I love Ian McDermott, we had to do something else, and that guy does not have, like his every second is accounted for. He has very little personal freedom, right? And he chooses to have very little personal freedom for the good of everybody else, right? There's sort
Mhm.
of there's an analogy in a way to the poor child in Omelas, right? In the Le Guin story, right? In,
Yeah.
in the case of a good king. And I have a lot of thoughts about that story. I keep trying to sort of crystallize, over the
He
course of my
clearly
life.
does take seriously that last part of his title, a servant of servants or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, Servant of the Servants of Earth, which is a riff on one of the papal titles, actually.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
They borrow, because the Solid Empire is just a absolute grab bag of plagiarism, stealing from earlier civilizations. Which, if you look at Western civilization, it's all we've all been pretending to be Roman for 2,000 years.
Yeah. Sure.
And I saw no reason that charade should not continue. And I but yeah, so like that's one way we sort of look at it. Because everybody's free will is ultimately bounded by practical sort of realities, right? And this is very clear in the case of kings and stuff, because they have limitations. But like there are things that you and I just can't do, right? Not It's not because we don't want to, or we couldn't theoretically choose to do it in a vacuum, but it's just not possible. I cannot right now, go to London, like, because I am here actually, right? And like that's a silly example, but that's just the way that it is. And so it's not that, like, I had a conversation. I was on this Catholic podcast, sort of talking about the consequentialist sort of interpretation of Hadrian's actions. It's not that Hadrian um, does a bad thing to achieve a good end. It is that all of his options were bad,
Hmm.
and he did his best within that framework, and is not precisely begging forgiveness from us, because we're not in a position to give it to him, not being in his universe or time. But he is making an account of himself, to be judged in a way, and that
Yeah.
is a form of accepting consequence,
Hmm.
or trying to receive consequence for his actions. Even if he's, you know, largely not in a position to receive any, let's say, without getting into the ending.
Yeah.
But but nobody really gets away with everything, anything really. You have to pay for what you do, either now or later, and so I try to capture that, and I try to capture the messiness of these situations because life is messy, politics is messy, and certainly the more power you have to affect the world, the messier your choices become. Just by definition, it's you and I are not wearing clothes that were probably made ethically. It's always the
Mm.
example I always give, and there's I like, what are you going to do about that? Be naked? You know, you have to decide like what choices you're able to do something about. And for some people, that's buying cage-free eggs, I suppose. But there are some things that you're blind to, you don't know about, and you can't get through life without doing harm. So
Mm.
even if you would like to. So again, your freedom is impeded somewhat by reality. So
Well, you've given me another perfect segue here because my last thematic question is about the morality of violence and war. And you mentioned Hadrian, and this is not a spoiler if you haven't picked up Empire of the Sun. It's in the very first paragraph. If you know anything, it's called the Sun Eater series for a reason. Hadrian has done something horrific to essentially affect millions of lives. And this essentially everything that follows is him explaining how we got there. So that is something I feel like you're exploring continuously, though. It's not just that one decision that he's explaining. This is something that I think, it's woven throughout Sun Eater, the morality of violence and war. Is it possible to justify horrific atrocities in such as blowing up the sun and killing millions of people, or the atomic bombs that we dropped on Japan in World War II being maybe a real world analog in a sense. Yeah, yeah. Is it possible to justify horrific atrocities?
I don't know. Maybe, right? One of the sort of classic examples that gets brought up against my fellow Catholics, right, is the treatment of the Amalekites by the Israelites, right? Now, there is a sense in which it's very common in ancient Near Eastern sources to just see enormous amounts of hyperbole, right? It's like we annihilated the Amalekites, and then the next chapter, you're like, and then we married them. It's like, okay, were they annihilated or did you marry them? I'm not sure, right? And this is just sort of the literary convention. But as a Christian, right, it's God authorizes certain atrocities, right? Now, like, is that because he's God and he gets a free pass? Maybe, right? Now that's a very interesting series of philosophical questions, and maybe not really worth getting into yet, but like, let's leave it at maybe, right? But I don't think that we should put ourselves in the same position, right?
Mhm.
Necessarily, we as humans, and Hadrian has sort of these weird supernatural things happen to him.
Yes.
Are they advanced aliens? Is it God? Is that the same thing? Is that, or science fiction is full of aliens pretending to be God, but like Sunyer may have the reverse going on, and it may not, depending on
Yeah.
your interpretation.
So given that
And
Hadrian is being used by something more powerful than he is, and that goes back to the free will question too. Like how much free will does he have? And I think that you're going to continue to explore that question, I'm sure. Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
and the advantage of literature is that I don't have to give you a sort of a short answer, right? The point of the story is to answer in the story, right? And but these are all things that, or rather, to explore the answer, because I ultimately, this is such a big question. It would be probably foolish of anybody to commit to an answer on it, right? But I would be remiss to not point out that classically we do distinguish between killing and murder, right?
Hmm.
So much so that you know. Other languages really differentiate between that more strongly than English does, right? Hebrew, for example, very clearly the fifth commandment is thou shalt not murder, right? It is not thou shalt not kill,
Hmm.
because killing is clearly allowed within certain limitations, right? Self-defense, right? The defense of others, and it is from the defense of others and self-defense that we extrapolate, that Aquinas extrapolates just war, right? It is clearly right? Acceptable to go and defend other people en masse in some way, right? This is sort of the justification for every modern interventionist war ever. And you can maybe argue with any particular one, but let's say in a vacuum, can you invade a country to stop a genocide? I think most modern, well-meaning people will say, of course, right? Uh, and maybe that is the answer, right? But when do you cross the line, and becoming the villain? Like this is where the sort of the question for the story is, because you could go in and handle the aggressors quite unpleasantly, right? And
Mhm.
become worse, right? And the devil always is in the details. He is a lawyer, seemingly, and uh, and that's where the space for drama really comes in. And I think the advantage of literature is that we don't have to come up with a neat answer. It's sort of enough to live with the consequences in a story and to sort of inspire thought in other people. But you can at least punch somebody to save somebody at minimum. Uh,
Okay. Yeah.
at
No,
minimum.
thank you. That's a
Um,
tough one, really, and I think you gave a great answer. So I'm done grilling you on the themes. I do want to ask because I'm very excited now that I'm deep into Sun Eater to learn a little bit about what you're up to currently. And you mentioned a couple times you dropped a little allusion to the fact that you are writing a new series.
yeah.
What can you? I'm not going to ask you specifics because I know often an author can't talk about some specifics. So I'm just going to ask you, what can you tell us about your current writing project?
Yeah, I could say a fair bit, I think. It's called the Doomsong Saga. It's trilogy, at least for the moment. You never know. I
Wait,
after
wasn't Sun Eater a trilogy at one
It
point?
was four
Okay.
originally, and yeah. So I look, I'm not good at math, Dr. Chase. But
I'm an English professor, so that's okay.
yeah, it's right out the window. But yeah, it's a trilogy. I am about two-thirds of the way through the first book now. But it is we talked about Kay sort of starting with these historical episodes and kind of reinterpolating them and putting the scenes in new context. It is uh, inspired by starts out as a retelling of the libation bearers, but in a fantasy setting, right? So it's set in a fantasy world wherein something like the Trojan War has happened. And a character who is not Agamemnon, but is, if you squint, is Agamemnon, has come home and has been murdered, and his children, right, a son and a daughter, are left to avenge him. The complication being, of course, that his killer is their mother.
Mother,
Uh,
Clytemnestra
and
in this equation. Yeah.
yes, yeah, and so it's not our Earth. It is a world, it's Middle Earth, right, in a sense, right? It's another place.
Okay.
Uh, Really, it's closer to the sort of world of K than Middle Earth, because Middle Earth is supposed to be prehistoric, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it's not, so the Agamemnon character's name is Alyatanes, right, for example, and
Okay. Great.
so everybody's got a different name, and it follows the two of them. They're two point of view characters, third person, and it cuts back and forth between them chapter for chapter as they sort of deal with the situation. And it is high fantasy. There are the gods are very present. There are things that are not human that are around all the time. No elves and dwarves, but we've got satyrs and cyclopes, and there's a centaur. We can't say centaur, of course, because there's no Centaurus. So, the challenge I've set myself is to not use any Greek words at all, actually.
Ooh.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I have done a lot of my favorite translation of Agamemnon and the Libation Bearers is done by Tony Harrison, and it is done in the style of Beowulf, the linguistic style of Beowulf.
Okay.
Uh,
All
and
right.
so this pitch is, I guess, targeted at you.
Yeah. This is
But it
working.
has a lot of kennings and a lot of compound words, and his translation is all done in alliterative verse. It's really, really great. It's on YouTube. If you look up Agamemnon and you see this like really grainy VHS sort of looking recording of guys in masks, it's that translation. It's tremendous. But I was very taken with the language of that translation, and so I am sort of running with it, let's say, in this one. And I just very excited about it. It's been going very, very well. Um, and I had the privilege with it of working with Jamie Jones, who's doing the cover art for it.
Oh, wonderful.
And he's almost done with the cover. It should be done in like a couple weeks.
Cover reveal
Uh,
coming, or when
yeah, very soon. Yeah, a couple months, I'd imagine,
okay.
before we'll see it. Um, but the first book is called The God-Stained House, and it will be out next year sometime, probably late next year.
Ooh,
Um,
okay.
and I just very, very excited about it.
I'll definitely
It's
be done with Sun Eater on time then. No problem. Yeah.
yeah, plenty of time. No need to rush. But it's unusual. I usually get pretty miserable in sort of the third quarter of the project, and it hasn't quite hit yet.
Hmm.
I this is the happiest I've been with a book in process since Howling Dark, which is a nice place to be.
Yeah.
Um, things have just been going very smoothly. So
Wonderful to hear. Thank you for sharing all that, and I'm sure that that people watching are going to be very excited, as excited as I am, to check this out when once it's out. So, and also thank you for taking the time to sit with me, Christopher. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I am really, as I said in the beginning, enamored with your series. Sun Eater has been a real highlight for me this year, and I can't wait to finish. I'm going to have a
yeah,
great
thank you.
for the rest of the series, I anticipate, and discussing it, and we'll continue having those discussions and sharing our thoughts. But thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, oh my gosh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, everybody, and thank you all for watching. But that is it for us for now. Until next time.